third and final speaker in this session. We have Mike Buttery to speak to us. He's the director of Werner International. He's an expert on dyeing and finishing. He did his ASDC from Bradford and his MBA from Bradford. He's been advising government, industry bodies and major companies on strategic issues in recent years. He's going to talk to us about trade agreements and their impact.
Good morning. As you're no doubt all aware, there have been a lot of developments regarding trade agreements over recent years. The most important, the most prominent, of course, being that of the Chinese accession to the WTO. In that light, and in light of the fact that China is the world's largest producer of textile goods, and the USA the world's largest importer and consumer of textile goods, I intend to look at the impact of those trade agreements with reference to that relationship. It has impact for everybody else as well, but very interesting in that area. So over recent years, the past 50 years or so, there's been a huge increase in textile production, I should say. I apologise for that. As a result, mainly of the new manufacturing technologies. Over the last 50 years, production has increased by a factor of 5 times, whilst the consumption per capita has doubled in that same period. So what you see is a very, very dramatic, almost exponential increase over that 50-year period in the production of textile materials. However, if you look at more detail into that area, you find that in the early stages growth was very, very rapid, 4% a year on average, slightly more. Over that 50-year period, that growth has slowed. We're now at a range around 2%. When you look beneath that level towards what is happening in major consuming nations, the USA and those countries in Europe, you find that that level is now closer to 1%. Those figures go back to 2000, they exclude 9/11. The industry has a history of movement. We're all aware of its original origins, but now, most recently, the shipments in materials, the shipments in machinery have been into Asia and Oceania. When you start to compare the numbers, as you can see, the comparison of new shipments is, for me, very worrying. Huge amount of equipment going into those areas. We did some work a little while ago on which we looked at specific countries, and one of the concerns there, specific to what we are talking about today, is the volume of equipment which is available. I've taken weaving as an example, but the comparison between the weaving industries or the spinning industries or the capacity in dyeing and finishing remains the same. The Chinese industry has a very, very large capacity in comparison to almost any other nation you would care to name. In fact, in this case, the Chinese capacity is equal to the other 10 countries mentioned in this particular study. All this is indicative of the shifts that we are experiencing from the Japanese in the 1960s, 1970s through into China, and now there is certainly a move into other countries in Asia. Indonesia is an example, and to a certain extent into some Latin American countries as well. Skip that. As we said, just for comparison's purposes, the USA is and this chart is in billions of US dollars, the largest importer of apparel goods. Whilst by comparison, the Chinese, also in billions of US dollars, is the world's largest exporter of those same apparel goods. A substantial percentage of that going into the US, of course. So as we said, the relationship between China and the USA is extremely important. In that light, the entry of China into the WTO becomes extremely important. A brief history. Those have got mixed up. A brief history of the trade agreements. The ones that are particularly relevant to the conversation today. The GATT agreements started in 1961. The most recent and the most interesting for us revolve around the multi-fibre agreements, which started in 1974, the most recent being 1994. Those cover the vast majority of the textile producing nations. The USA has, in addition to those, been looking at its own trading position. So it's established free trade agreements with Canada, with Mexico, which later became known as the NAFTA agreements, with 24 countries, mainly small islands in the Caribbean nation, and most recently with a group of African countries. The CBI agreements and the Sub-Saharan African agreements are also combined and have been advanced. There have been changes in quota allowances and so on beyond these days. Something that not many people are aware of, there is in fact a bilateral trade agreement in existence between the USA and China, which in light of the conversation again is going to be very, very important to the discussion. And of course, to bring this up finally, the entry of China into the WTO. That bilateral trade agreement is extremely interesting. At the point at which China was expressing its initial interest in joining the WTO, a number of discussions were had. During that period, it became apparent that in all probability, China would join the WTO as at the point in quota elimination at whatever date that was. This was a great concern to the US government. So prior to this, they managed to negotiate, as a bilateral agreement, a further agreement which allows the United States to apply further quotas if imports exceed certain values. That quota can be in place for no longer than 4 years, but it does add to the protection that the US industry can be afforded. The CBI agreement was later developed into the Caribbean Trade Partnership Act, wonderful title. What is particularly interesting here for those countries who already have trade agreements with the United States is that this was the first of a range of agreements which were unilateral in nature. In other words, the receiving government or country was not required to open up their markets in any way to US imports. Previous agreements had all stated that the domestic market, the recipient country, had to be open to some or all US imports. This particular act is known internally within the US government as the Asian Veto, the intention being to allow US manufacturers, US producers, to take advantage of lower cost economies in the Caribbean region, initially for the makeup of their goods, their apparel goods, and possibly later for transfer of other technologies. However, the way this Act is written currently has created a number of concerns within the US industry, not least of which that the CBI agreement and the Sub-Saharan African agreement, the countries involved in those, the Asian investors can use those locations to take advantage of the special access terms which the USA has negotiated. So in other words, there's a great possibility that China, Taiwan, Indonesia can use that as a base to bring goods in. Particularly in the way that the Sub-Saharan African agreement is written, there's a strong concern that this can be used as a base for transshipment of goods. In other words, the goods will simply arrive in a Sub-Saharan African country and then be transported from there into the US market without the significant tariffs and quotas which are currently in place for the manufacturers in Asia. In 2000, this was extended even further into what is now referred to as the Trade and Development Act. The basic principle is the same, to allow the US manufacturers to take advantage of lower cost manufacturing areas. The difference here is simply that the quotas and the tariffs are even lower than they were in the Sub-Saharan African Treaty. In some cases, they are trying to eliminate almost entirely those quotas and tariffs. It does in fact bring a lot of the benefits of the original NAFTA open borders treaty between the USA and Mexico and the USA and Canada to these other agreements. This is particularly interesting in light of the fact that the NAFTA agreement required the opening of the borders, the opening of the markets, the domestic markets of Mexico and Canada. It places Mexico and Canada at a disadvantage. Further developments have been ongoing. The Andean Trade Preferences Act is looking to offer the same basic principles but to goods made in Andean countries, into Peru, which is interesting given the President's most recent visit there. I'm certain that something will come out of that. At the moment there are no open mentions of that. But this does provide for a duty-free treatment of up to 70 million square metres of knit fabric, knitted apparel from those areas, with a quota rate scheduled at 16% over the life of that bill. This bill should expire between 2005 and 2006. Again, there's a little bit of confusion in this area. As a result of this act does not include Brazil. So as a result of this act, Brazil is looking for preferential access to the USA. It's looking for the same benefits for its industry, which of course is a very substantial industry, very large industry. The most recent and interesting development, personally for myself, is as a result of the Bush administration's current war on terrorism. There is a desire within the Bush administration to use the textile preferences treatment to assist those countries which provide assistance in turn for the war on terrorism. This is the best example of this is Pakistan, where as a result of their assistance in the recent war, they have actually requested and received a number of benefits, the total value of which is estimated over the next 3 years to be worth $500 million to the Pakistani industry. It's almost certain that this same carrot, you may call it, will be used to recompense other governments, other lesser developed nations in that same fight on terrorism. There's a distinct possibility that countries like India or Sri Lanka, so possibly Turkey, and almost certainly the Philippines will receive some similar agreement, some similar assistance. This was an extremely brief summary, for that I apologise. But what's of particular interest is China's entry into the WTO and the impact that that may have for all of us. When China entered the WTO, they received two significant benefits which had not previously been received by people entering. The first of these, or the major element of this, is that they entered at the current condition, at the current state regarding quota elimination, regarding tariff reduction. Any products which are now fully integrated under the current WTO rules will also be fully integrated for China. So again, this means that the Chinese government will not have to pay tariffs on those goods, will not have quotas on those goods. I apologise. There are some tariffs. They will not have to cope with any quota. Where those quotas do exist, China has the benefit of the quota at the current level, not as it might have been 5 or 6 years ago, but as it is today. Obviously, this is a significant advantage. It places China on an equal footing with everybody else. Looking at this in a little bit more detail, in 1995, the multi-fibre agreement laid down the quotas and the quota growth rates for quota elimination over this next 10-year period. What this chart is showing is that in January 1995, 16% of all goods to which quotas were applied should have those quotas removed in their entirety. And as you progress through those dates, you can see that more and more and more products would have those quotas eliminated. At the same time, those quotas which were still in existence would grow. Again, there was a schedule for the growth rate. In addition to this, the countries that signed to the multi-fibre agreement and under the WTO rules agreed to cut the tariffs on their imported goods. Their expectation was that the developed nations, the USA, Canada, Western Europe and a few others, would cut their average tariff rate by 1/3, 33%. However, because this is an average tariff rate, in truth, what has happened is those items which are not deemed to be significant to the industry have had 100% of those tariffs eliminated, whilst those items which are significant and sensitive for the given country's industry have received the most minimal of tariff reductions. Essentially, those tariff reductions are entirely dependent upon the import sensitivity of the products. So once again, the wording of the multi-fibre agreement has allowed a certain level of protection for these countries' industries to be maintained. A major question is, will these tariffs and quotas ultimately be eliminated as per the schedule in 2005? Well, one thing we have to do first of all is look at what is the current situation with respect to compliance. Are the countries fulfilling their requirements under those agreements? Essentially, the world splits into two aspects in this area. There are the developing nations where historically the measurement devices have not existed. In these nations, approximately 50% have actually today notified the WTO of any licensing agreements or restrictions on imports which currently exist. There are 50% of the nations who have not done this. Only 1/3 of countries have actually designated and supplied the information for a person, a contact person, to whom any questions and queries can be addressed. Very difficult, therefore, to find the information you need. Less than 50% of the companies have notified the WTO of their technical trade requirements, the standards that you need to achieve to enter that market. And over 2/3 of those nations have yet to give the WTO the list which they are obliged to do of the subsidies which they currently apply. Under all these circumstances, of course, it's almost impossible to actually establish how well the quota reduction schedule and the tariff schedule are actually being applied in these nations. Further to this, many of those developed countries have not as yet put in place the necessary controls for customs valuation. We do not know into many of these countries, or out of many of these countries, exactly what is the trade volume. Again, it becomes very difficult to see if the quotas are being applied. Because of this, the US government has repeatedly threatened a certain list of countries that they will not receive the allocated quota improvements and tariff reductions that the USA should apply under the current WTO rules. On the other side of the coin, we have those countries which are most commonly referred to as the developed nations, particularly the European Union and the USA, where a lot of this basic infrastructure was in place at the outset of the WTO agreement. However, the full advantage of all the opportunities that a weakly worded agreement has allowed them. The result of this is that these countries were allowed to list articles which never attracted a quota as those articles which have. And as with the tariffs, the more sensitive items, those on which the US industry is most concerned, have been left currently until this final stage. This for me is a very interesting list, for want of a better term. At the outset of the WTO, the USA At the outset of this, the USA had 757 quotas in place. Currently, today, they have only applied some 43 of those quota reductions. This means that they have 7.4% applied, nearly 93%, 92% have yet to be removed. The quota growth in these areas has exceeded the market size in some aspects. So in truth, some of the quotas which still apply are not inhibiting the market. Within the EU, there is a slightly better situation. First of all, there were fewer items which attracted a quota in the first place, and of those numbers, more as a percentage have been eliminated to date. Just for comparison purposes, you can see that Norway, having one of the fewest levels of quotas originally anyway, has managed to eliminate all of those today. The impact of that agreement. The Sub-Saharan African Agreement is anticipated to give more than 4.2 billion US dollars to those countries by the year 2008. With China, there is a huge potential for productive increase. One of the major questions is, the market is therefore, with this quota reduction, but can they produce sufficient quality in sufficient volumes? Having spent some time in China and having seen the factories and the quality of the equipment that they have got, the quality that they are investing in, and the use to which they are putting them, I have to say, the capacity is there. Currently, in most plants, efficiency productivity levels are very, very low. Part of this is there is no reason to raise that level. With the elimination of quotas, that drive will come into being. There's a good chance that those efficiency levels will be pushed higher. China will have to demonstrate its willingness to open its markets. It has done so recently. I noticed something on the news recently about the opening of the banking sector. If China continues to do that, they will probably manage to stay the hand of the US government in applying those further quotas that originate with the 1997 Act. What does this mean for the industry? Well, particularly for the US domestic industry, we're looking at a reduction by 2005 in textile shipments of 4 billion US dollars. The apparel sector is going to be even harder hit with an expected reduction of over 7 billion US dollars. In that same period, the imports into China are going to rise from their current 15 to 18% level to an anticipated 31%. This is going to have a knock-on effect for those people importing for the rest of the world. And at the same time, it's anticipated that given the productive capacity increase from China, that there will be an increase in that value of over 18 billion US dollars, a major shift in trade. So overall, this means there will be a net increase into the US of 9 billion in imports. But in that area, there will be a loss of also 9 billion approximately for the other importers, the non-Chinese importers. This is where your 18 billion comes from. What does this mean? Well, as we've said, there's a significant shift in the marketplace. As we said, also, there is the growth is slowing. The continuing opening up of the world to trade agreements and business in general, the application of trade agreements in the fight against terrorism, etc., will continue to drive down prices. There will be increasing price pressures. This will require that the current business strategies have to be changed. I think, as we said earlier, the ability to compete on commodity items is going to be extremely difficult, particularly in light of the Chinese current labour rates and their general cost levels. So overall, we're going to need to create businesses which are far more market aware. We're going to need to create businesses which are based on good cost control, high efficiency, and this in itself will require that the current management are very well trained and the production managers have access to cost information, marketing knowledge. In other words, we need to breed a new level, a new quality of manager who can combine the skills of production, marketing and costing. And it's at that point that I would like to leave it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mike. We'll dispense with any questions because we do need to move on to the lunch time. I think, though, that you'd have to concede that this morning's program has been very broad-ranging and very high quality. I mean, if you're interested in textiles, we've had new developments in R&D, the environmental challenge, cotton quality, fabric formation, value-added to agricultural products, especially in relation to Egyptian cotton, and this very interesting paper on the effects of tariffs on where the textile industry of the future will be. So I'd like you all to thank all of our speakers this morning in the normal ways. Please thank all our speakers.